an example that in the popular mind, cultural mind, raises the very sorts of questions, dichotomous questions we're talking about spiritual or physical, which is sleep paralysis. So I'll set it up for the audience and then I'll kick it over to you before I share my thoughts. But, so for anybody who doesn't know, sleep paralysis is this phenomena where a person, wakes up and yet they can't move, can't speak, but they begin to see things and they begin to see certain patterns, certain shadow people, shadow people with red eyes. Sometimes those shadow people speak, right? Those sorts of things. And it's very oppressive. It's very dark. It's very traumatic. Many of the reports include seeing the same types of things, right? There's the Hat Man as one that shows up regularly. And that. And they have this experience until until it goes away, and then they regain their faculties and things like that. And obviously there are plenty of Christians and folks who believe in the spiritual realm who are like, that's demonic, right? Like what you're seeing is demons. But of course, the more scientifically minded folks, meaning people, I always put that in scare quotes because I think if you understand what science is, there is not a dichotomy between science and religion. Scientifically minded typically means that you treat science as the be all end all of knowledge. You have a reductionistic materialist view where you only believe in, you're an empiricist who only believes in what you can poke and prod, and all of that sort of stuff. So the contemporary scientifically minded person is then inherently skeptical because they don't believe in the spiritual realm. And they tend to offer an explanation of that. That's a purely chemical, scientific, here's the dream state that you're in and so on. So with something like that, I mean, what is your disposition? What is your take on something like that? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? Is it both?
No, it's both. Okay. I mean, it's my physical body who's experiencing it. So it's physical for me because it's happened to me. I mean, I've talked to people. I got people in my parish it's happened to, and I don't know them from Adam. They just tell me the story, and I'm like, that happened to you too?
Yeah, I've met a lot of people. I've cataloged a lot of my own stories. Plus, there's also a documentary called The Nightmare that catalogs a bunch of these. Yeah. But go ahead.
And you can see them in the films. Go look at Emily Rose's story, the possession of Emily Rose, see how that started. So the same thing. Mine happened when I was 10. So that was kind of scary for me because I didn't know what was going on.
I believe
at the time. I probably not should have written a paper on ESP at 10. So
is that what occasioned it?
Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking back, but no, I was in my bed and I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't talk, couldn't move, and this shadow walks right down the hall and stands right next to my bed. And that was 51 years ago, but I can remember it like it was yesterday. And it was time stops too. That's the thing. When you go, like when you're sleeping, time stops. You don't know what's going on when you're sleeping. But I know I was fully awake. Because when I let that scream out, when I finally got the release, Mom and Dad were in there in a second. Because I screamed, I was a curdling scream. So I had the experience of that. Now people can flop it off whatever they want, but you and I got too many people we know that have gone through the same thing.
So what, let's pretend I was a skeptic. What sort of thing would you point to say, the physical side of it is obviously real, like your body can't move and things like that. But what is it that leads you to believe that it has a spiritual component to it?
Well, at the time, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But that would go back to my presuppositions and my faith, my worldview. It goes back to your worldview. I tell these doctors all the time, even where I work, when we take someone to the hospital, I said, your whole worldview is based on faith. One doctor said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, how do you determine if someone's got a chemical imbalance? You open up the DSM and just say, here are the symptoms. Here's the label. How do you know they got a chemical imbalance? The only way you can test for a chemical imbalance is to do a spinal tap. Are you doing spinal taps on all these people? No. I said, well, you're just guessing then. So they don't like to admit it, that they have a faith system that they believe in. And I can't prove that I had that experience happen, except that I know it happened. And that's just, they're the same way when you get down to brass tacks and the discussion. But what they like to do is they like to loom their doctorates over you. I'm the medical doctor. You're not a medical doctor. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. No, I do know that is a real challenge with the, I do think there is a sort of false appeal to authority. And here I'm using that in the sort of fallacious, it's logical fallacy sense, where so often one of the ways in which you try to protect the sciences from being impugned by anybody who might challenge it, right? Like the sort of challenge that I leveled, where I said, look, when you're saying healthy and unhealthy, what are you basing it on? Because you've waded into philosophical waters where we have to actually talk about things like teleology, whether there's a God, the nature of man, how you discern the telos of a thing, and so on. What are you basing it on other than your own sort of declaration as a mental health authority that's what's healthy and unhealthy? And I do think at the end of the day, that really is part of the problem with it, is that rather than recognizing that it's wading into waters that requires sort of deep philosophical investigation and scrutiny and is not above scrutiny, right? And that in many ways, oftentimes what's identified as healthy or unhealthy is either arbitrary or just reflective of cultural trends. Yeah. That, the way you try to bypass that is an appeal to authority. Well, we're the mental health experts, meaning we're the sort of priest class that is able to peer behind the curtain and tell you the mysteries of the universe that are too deep for you, and you need to sort of submit to those types of things. But the fact of the matter is they're not above scrutiny. I mean, what I would say regarding like sleep paralysis, for example, first of all, I would call out the sort of problematic nature of the reductionistic empiricist tendency, right? So you can sit here and identify, the sort of scientific explanation is to say, well, look, we know that the brain, when it's in sleep paralysis, is doing this. And because it's in this state that's sort of between awake and asleep, that tells us that it's purely a mental state, right? Something like that. Now, of course, in the way I phrased that, I conflated mind and brain, which contemporary science often does, which was your point when you asked the question to the doctor, right? Whether it's whether a brain state is a mental state. And only a reductionistic empiricist would conflate those two. But that usually is the tendency to try to say, because we can identify what's going on in the brain, we've therefore identified the cause. But the problem with that is and therefore, since that's the cause, it's not real, right? You're not seeing shadow people. But of course, the problem is that if you presented to me pie and we were doing a brain scan, you would see how my brain reacts. Yeah. And yet we don't follow that to the conclusion that therefore there's no pie, right? Just because the chemicals in my brain react to, the presence of that doesn't mean that there's no presence there, right? So I think the argument itself, the reductionistic argument itself, is fallacious and ridiculous. But the other thing is, and I'm sure you've had stories like this, there are too many stories that just don't fit that interpretation. So I know of stories in which two people have sleep paralysis in the same room and see the same things. And so that's highly problematic if you're going to suggest that it's a hallucination that is purely in one person's mind, right? How do you have these sort of shared hallucinations? The other problem is that the triggers for these are oftentimes spiritual. So I do know plenty of stories in which there's something genuinely like demonic, some sort of demonic encounter, ritualistic encounter, something like that, that occasions that they experience it. And also similarly with that, there's too many stories of people who end up liberated from sleep paralysis either because they somehow managed to get themselves to invoke the name of Christ, That happens in the documentary The Nightmare. You can find there one of the stories that they talk about. Or other people, like I know people who, after they're chrismated or they, become catechumen or something like that, and they become sanctioned by the church, all of a sudden there's a shift that happens, and they're liberated in some way. And so the problem is there's just too many markers that say this isn't just a brain state. Right. Like, yes, it makes an impression on the brain. Yes, there's a physical element to it. But again, I think this goes into the sort of false dichotomy that's oftentimes at work, where people think something is either physical or it's spiritual. And if it's a spiritual, you shouldn't see anything happening in the brain, which when you say it out loud like that, you realize that's absurd. Like, why on earth would you think in a world where spirit and flesh are connected, that spiritual things would make no impressions on the body? Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.